During the Middle Ages, Europe launched a series of 8 wars aimed at capturing Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks. These wars, collectively referred to as the Crusades, were essentially religious wars carried out between the armies of the Christian West and the Muslim East. But beyond the common theme of religion versus religion and the West's desire to capture and hold the city of Jerusalem, the Crusades have little in common with each other, and their overall effect of East-West relations and the sweep of history are generally misunderstood. I'm Carolyn Morrison, your host, welcoming you to another episode of Mysteries of the Church.
The basic notion of a crusade, what makes it different from just simply waging a war, is that the Pope used the power of Peter's keys to promise that any person who fell in battle would automatically obtain forgiveness of all the temporal punishment due to their sins. It's an expression which comes from the old catechism. We would call it indulgence today. But it was the notion that if you made this sacrifice for God, then God would be pleased with that sacrifice and not allow you to fall to be punished for your sins.
Well, certainly in the earliest period, Western Europe is aware of Islam, but not directly. So when the Muslim armies come across North Africa through Spain and push up into central France. So this is where Europeans really become aware that these Muslims are a force to be reckoned with. So they're aware of Muslim armies really through the West more so than the East, but they're unprepared for what is actually going to happen, for the extent and the speed with which these Muslim armies are moving.
They were very unaware of this growing faith. And remember, Islam spreads very, very quickly and very, very rapidly during this time period. And one of the ways it did spread so quickly is that something called the jizya tax had been imposed. The jizya tax said unless you were a part of this new Islamic faith, you couldn't participate in trading. You'd have to pay so much more in taxes, etc.
And when the Muslims turned around and said, you both want to get advantages from us, we are going to be more aggressive in deciding how much you pay us for these privileges and so forth, and we will play one side against the other side. Then we have this cauldron, this boiling group of different factions and interests, commercial and national, that then play up against the divisions in belief and doctrine.
We see it more as this, I would say during this time period, we see it more as the Holy Land is so far away. It's more of almost a concept than it is a reality.
The idea of a war to retake the holy places got very popular in Europe. A pope like Urban II thought it would be a very good idea to divert some of this warlike energy in Europe off to a place safely apart to go recapture the Holy Land, holy places, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, all of that, from the infidels. They had gotten to think of Muslims as infidels.
The Muslim community is growing more and more in influence. They're growing more and more in terms of science, more and more in terms of philosophy, more and more in terms of art. And their political power begins to grow more and more and more as well.
At the death of Muhammad, the first of the caliphs, the first of the successors, Caliph Omar, who captured Syria, Damascus, and then Jerusalem, and spread Islam then right across North Africa, all the way across to Morocco, and the family eventually moved it right up into Spain.
Islam, like Christianity, and to a certain extent Judaism, underwent periods in which There was great fervor, then there was a decline in fervor, a need for reform, a reform movement. And the moment of the Crusades was put into play by the Seljuk Turks, who assumed a military role and dominance in the Islamic world, pushing aside the Arabs who for a long time had been very tolerant of connections and pilgrimages and sharing of shrines and so forth in the Holy Land, as we would call it.
Christianity would have at the time begun to feel a little threatened about what was going on, especially around Jerusalem. Jerusalem suddenly becomes a city not just with two faiths, but with three. We have the Christian religion there, the land where Christ walked. You have Judaism there as the area, really the holy city, and now you see a rapidly growing increase of Muslim people. And so there's this dynamic tension that exists in that area at that moment where three faiths suddenly have to start to learn to live with each other, and not only to learn to live with each other, to do business with each other.
Like most of the world's conflicts, the Crusades stem not from one single cause, but were the result of many different and conflicting influences. When we come back, we will learn that during the Crusades, as is true in the present, when politics and religion mix, the outcome is inevitably driven more by politics than religion. In the past, it was commonly believed that the Crusaders viewed the Holy Land largely as a source of loot, but this is far from the truth. While some Crusaders may have been motivated by greed, others undertook the arduous journey to the Holy Land for a wide variety of reasons. Some went because they truly believed that driving the Turks out of the Holy Land was a righteous cause. Others considered their military service as a religious pilgrimage or penance to remit past sins. Whatever their reason for joining the Crusades was, tens of thousands of men would answer the call.
Over a 10-year period, we're talking really between 1085 and 1095, almost 30,000 Christians are killed. And they're killed during this time period, and we begin to see that Christian churches, convents, monasteries are transformed. They become barns, they become desacralized. And so during this time period, many among Christian Europe's leaders begin to realize this is a very serious change.
The flashpoint for the Crusades really comes from the east. In the year 1071, the Byzantine forces meet the Turks in the battle in what is now eastern Turkey, and they're thoroughly routed. The Turks destroy the Byzantine army and move their capital closer and closer and closer to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. That's when the First Crusade really gets started, when the Emperor of Constantinople writes a letter to the West appealing for help, a desperate letter appealing for help from Western armies to come and help repel the Muslim armies effectively. And he seems to want a few hundred knights. A Western mounted armed knight is a formidable figure. And we have numerous accounts. You line these guys up, you charge them at Eastern forces, and there's no answer for it. It's terrifying. This seems to be what he wants. A few hundred knights to come over, push the Turks back, regain some of the territory, and that's what he wants.
Pope Urban II realizes that so many areas that once were Christian are now entirely being conquered. They're almost entirely de-Christianized, if you will. And so he calls people together. He calls a council of clergymen together. He calls councils of bishops together. He calls Christian leaders together. And he says, we need to come to the aid of Byzantium. We need to come to the aid of Emperor Alexis. And yes, it is seen as political, but it's also seen as this religious aspect, this religious duty.
Pope Urban believed that the success that the Norman Knights and other Christian Latin Knights had had in pushing back against Islam, and of course Spain was a big part of that, he considered the possibility that Jerusalem could be conquered, a kingdom could be established, there would be a feudal reproduction of Europe, and that would allow Christians to control that area. They would allow Muslims and they would allow Jews to continue to practice their religion, but now under the rule of a Christian word.
There are actually 5 different accounts of what exactly Urban II says in his sermon. There's definitely some mention of some kind of an indulgence, but it's unclear at this first stage what exactly it is that he's offering. You'll hear it said it's forgiveness of all sins and you go straight to heaven. Doesn't seem to be exactly what he says. It's more limited than that, but it's definitely a promise of a spiritual reward. If you leave everything and you die, there is a spiritual reward waiting for you. And that appeals to people in a way that there's no precedent for. No one is prepared for what happens. Even Urban is not expecting what happens.
When Pope Urban first made his appeal, Clermont, it was picked up immediately. It was very popular. There was a man from Amiens in France, Peter the Hermit.
Peter the Hermit was someone who came from France. He was a simple priest, and he hears Pope Urban II's call to Crusades. And what he does is he takes up something called the People's Crusade. Peter goes and gathers people together, Christian people together, and says, we need to get over to that Holy Land. We need to get over there, and we need to help make this Holy Land holy once again. And he begins to gather people from place to place, from town to town. And some of the people whom he had gathered, they weren't quite your warrior types. They're your average Joes. They're the people around the streets. And he's gathering people, and some were even vagrants whom he gathered. And they're trying their way, trekking their way across Europe, going over eventually, trying to make their way to the Middle East. And more than half the people whom he collects wind up dying because they're certainly not prepared to cross Europe in a winter. It was basically a case of over-enthusiasm.
It was a disaster on all fronts. They have to pass through Christian lands to get where they're going. But these are Christian lands with small towns or even mid-sized cities that aren't expecting 60,000 people to show up at their gates who are hungry and tired and thirsty. So there are lots of accounts of atrocities committed against other Christians by this, what we now call the People's Crusade, moving east, as well as Jews. The idea is we're going to the east, to Jerusalem, to fight the enemies of Christ. The enemies of Christ are right here. So there's some terrible atrocities committed against Jews on their way as well. They make it to Constantinople. Just beyond Constantinople, they're ambushed and slaughtered, basically to a man, by Turkish forces.
When people went on these crusades, they did it as penance for their sins. They did it as good works, and this was understood as good works. I think we're very unlikely to think of it as good works now. This was a killing expedition.
This is the first wave of the First Crusade, often distinguished by calling it the People's Crusade. The technical First Crusade was led by a group of noblemen. So there are no kings in the First Crusade, it's noblemen, many of whom, frankly, are looking for expansion opportunities. And they're leading forces from their region with people who owe them allegiances, so they all go east together. They leave there expecting to be in Jerusalem in a few months. It takes 2 years. They're going through the mountains of Turkey where it's very hot in the summer, it's very cold in the winter. Thousands of them die of thirst, of malnutrition, of exposure. We have accounts that they're so thirsty they're killing and bleeding their horses and drinking the blood of their horses to survive. So this is 2 years of horror, and they're being attacked by everyone along the way because no one wants them there.
Now, I have to add to that the ordinary way of waging war in days of castles and knights and horses was to surround the castle and say to the people, if you don't submit to us and surrender, we'll kill everybody inside. So you better save your life by giving us what we need, giving us the place that we want to stay, give us gold or whatever, and then you'll be spared and we'll be happy. Nobody will die in the battle. So that was the ordinary way that battles were waged. It was the way that Christians waged war. It was the way Muslims waged war. What they didn't expect was that a city would say, we won't surrender.
While the Crusades may have begun with a justifiable cause and the best of intentions, it would seem that even as the armies of Europe were about to recapture Jerusalem, things were going horribly wrong. How they ultimately turned out will be the subject of the next segment, so stay with us. Beyond all reasonable expectations, the Crusaders captured sizable areas of the Turkish-controlled Middle East, including the Holy City of Jerusalem in 1099. Surprisingly, for all the fighting and death, the fall of Jerusalem seems to have gone nearly unnoticed in the rest of the Muslim world. But along with the Crusaders' victory came new problems, including what to do with their newly captured territory and how to govern it.
So you have an exhausted crew finally making their way in, and when they do, it's total chaos. What happens now that you've taken the city? Who's in charge? What do you do at this point? Who's going to go where?
They take Jerusalem. What happens inside cannot be counted as success, and it's not at all what Urban wanted. Massacre of the Muslims living in the city. There are many Jews living in the city as well. There are no Eastern Christians in the city at the time. They've all been expelled, but massive amounts of death and slaughter. And the Western accounts tell this. The Crusader accounts tell about people riding through the city up to their knees in blood. Perhaps some hyperbole, but certainly a lot of truth that it's not at all what the Pope wants, that's for sure. So they realize they're a long way from home and they can't get along with each other. And so they actually establish 4 what we call Crusader states, centered around 4 major cities in the east. And the idea is to keep the pilgrimage lines open all the way down to Jerusalem. So you have 4 separate crusading states led by 4 separate noblemen, each of them ostensibly trying to protect Jerusalem, but really looking out for their own interests.
Well, the Arabs at that time were in terrible disarray. The Arab Caliphate had fallen to Turks, who had been their mercenary army. They had made the mistake that many other empires do of having their defense completely dependent on foreigners, and the Turks took over. Arabs in disarray, they weren't in a very good condition to resist. When eventually the resistance to the Crusaders grew enough to recapture Jerusalem.
What happens is in the east there's a famous leader named Saladin who has crushed the crusading armies and taken back the city of Jerusalem. A crusade is launched, and this time there are kings. Philip II of France, Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, the original Redbeard, and most famously Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, who launch a crusade together. Now, unfortunately, Frederick drowns before they really even get on their way. So now you have a French king and an English king. They've never gotten along well. Richard takes the island of Cyprus. He gets some control along the coast and is on the verge of taking the city of Jerusalem, but he never successfully takes it.
The only way he can take over Jerusalem is to destroy it, which would then, of course, make it impossible to have the shrines of worship and pilgrimage that were there to begin with. So how can you say you win if the reason that you want to win, that is to have the pilgrimages, is lost?
They never did get Jerusalem on this Third Crusade. Instead, they got the city of Acca on the coast, a bit north of Haifa, and that became the center of the Christian kingdom. And when they arrived first and besieged the city and broke the walls, they took a lot of prisoners. There were 3,000 of them. And Richard the Lionheart sent his ultimatum to Saladin that he must get a variety of things he wanted, or he would kill the prisoners. He didn't get the thing he wanted, so he killed the prisoners. And that massacre of 3,000 prisoners was a kind of lasting mark on the Crusader army. It was into the 13th century by now that the Emperor Frederick II was being urged to go on crusade. Pope Innocent III, as a matter of fact, was pushing him. When eventually Frederick did organize one and went off again by ships to the Holy Land, he made a treaty with the Muslims that he got Christian access to Jerusalem and Christian administration under sovereignty for 10 years.
Certainly there's lack of success after lack of success after lack of success. So there's that aspect of it, and an increasingly mobilized, unified Muslim force in the East, Turkish force in the East, that's pushing back.
And so the Crusades becomes this vortex in which greater and greater violence is necessary in God's name to keep the crusade going, even though the original purpose was to avoid violence and to end the conflict.
In the very beginning of the 13th century, a crusade was organized. It was to go by ship. Enthusiasm was rather less, and they had a lot of trouble raising money for the fleet. And eventually they managed to rent a fleet from the Republic of Venice. So they decided as a new money-making venture to attack Constantinople.
So initially you have the Emperor of Byzantium writing for help. It's certainly a bitter irony that they go there ostensibly to help. They think they're going there to help. They still expect Constantinople to help them. It doesn't happen and things go terribly wrong. It is a bitter irony. You start by trying to protect Constantinople and you end by attacking it.
The Christians from Europe, of course, were relatively few numbers, so that the Arabs and these others, Muslims in their own homeland, they were able to muster much larger armies. They were also better suited to fighting in that climate.
The Turks ultimately win. There's no question they ultimately win. So 1291 they kick the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. In 1453 they take Constantinople. So it's a several hundred years coming, but they ultimately win. They take the Middle East. The Crusades are not successful. After several hundred years and all these lives that are lost, they aren't a success.
The First Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem may have begun in 1096 with the best of intentions, and they were certainly not undertaken without political and military provocation. When we come back, we will look at the remaining 8 Crusades and see how they fell far short of their political aims and the Christian ideals which the original Crusaders vowed to uphold. By any standard, the Crusades were a political and social disaster. And like all wars, they left an indelible mark on future relations between the nations which took part in them. But how should we, as modern Christians, deal with their legacy and help the world overcome the deep animosity which the Crusades bred so very long ago?
When we look to the question, what ultimate good came out of the Crusades, one of the things that we might be able to say is that Christianity begins to see itself more and more as a religion that needs to dialogue with the culture, needs to dialogue with other faiths. The world is a lot bigger than we had originally thought, and there are people in the world who aren't at all Christian.
Well, the Pope has officially apologized for the Crusades, so that's a positive move, but some people will choose not to forget. And unfortunately, because of political tensions in parts of the world today, when an army from the West comes to a part of the Middle East, the language for those in the Middle East is crusade. That's what they see, another Western invading army. So American political activity for us may not seem like it has anything to do with the 11th century. For people in Iran and Iraq, it has everything to do with the 11th century.
It does lead to this image of East versus West, of Islam versus Christianity. And that's something that truly was never, ever meant to be.
What we cannot deny is the effect of the Crusades upon the whole fabric of Christendom. That is to say, the realization that we cannot use violence to hold together our spiritual kingdom. And if we look at the Crusades as a learning moment for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I think we see a part of our own current struggles with tolerance or intolerance, cooperation, not cooperation. And I think we can learn that violence is no solution.
If we had more of St. Francis of Assisi and less of Richard the Lionheart involved in the Crusades, I think we'd be in a very, very different state in the world today.
As Americans, we tend to have short cultural memories. People in other parts of the world don't. So what happened to your family 1,000 years ago happened to you in a way that we don't quite understand because we don't have the same kind of history. So the Crusades is alive and well in the East and in the West, in Europe and in the Middle East today as much as it was in the 12th century.
Viewing the Crusades from the distance of 700 years, it is hard to imagine why they ever took place. As Christians, we do not and cannot approve of war and the suffering and death that accompany it. But sadly, even the Church long ago faced the fact that war and suffering are an inevitable condition of human society. The only true hope for a lasting peace in the Holy Land must be found in a forgiveness of past transgressions and the knowledge that all religions must be free to live and work together. But this tolerance must extend throughout the world and not only in the land where our Savior lived. I'm Carolyn Morrison, and I look forward to seeing you again next time on Mysteries of the Church.